Are you tired of wrestling with complex state management and constant refetching in your React apps? Well, get ready for a game changer. In this tutorial, we'll explore TanStack React Query, the ultimate tool for effortless data fetching, caching, and real-time updates. Say goodbye to clunky code and hello to lightning-fast UI. Trust me, once you see how React Query works, you'll never want to go back. Ready to level up your React projects? Let's dive in. Okay, everyone. So now let's get started. As you can see, I already have over here a project that I set up just running npx create feed, but this could work with any other method you want to generate your React application. My project is completely empty. I haven't made any changes, and we want to start by installing the TanStack Query library. So I'm going to come over here, open up a terminal, and I'm going to run npm install at TanStack/React Query. As that is installing, when you generate a React Query application, when you're creating one, you want to go to the entry point of your app, may it be the main.jsx or the app.jsx, wherever you want, but it has to be the higher point. And you want to define what is known as your query client. Now, this is going to be where you're defining the instance of React Query in your project and where you want to also wrap around the React Query provider so that your project has actual access to the library. So you want to do that on the highest level of your project so that your entire project has access to React Query. But you could indeed, if you want only a part of your project to have access to it, do it there and pass the provider to that specific group of components. But in our case over here, we want our entire project to have access to it. So we just want to come to the main.jsx, and I'm going to import at the top from at TanStack Query or React Query, and I want to import the query client and the query provider or the query client provider. Then down here, I want to create a variable called client, and I'm going to set it equal to new query client. Perfect. Now, to actually enable React Query inside of our project, all we have to do is wrap our app component, which is the entry point of our app, with the query client provider. And then just pass the client as part of props to that component. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it over here. Perfect. Now that means that anywhere in our app, like we're going to have access to the different hooks and functions that the library provides for us. And now that we have that set up, let's start with some simple data fetching. For this tutorial, we're going to be using over here a public API that I like to use in my videos. It's the JSON placeholder API. And if you go to this URL over here, you should get data or a list of objects that represent fake data for posts. So if you want to do that, you could do that. They also have it for, I believe, users. If I grab this and I put it over here, we should see data for users. Actually, I might do it for users instead of posts. However, it seems like there's a very little amount of users. So let's just use posts as an example for this tutorial. So how do we actually set up a system where in our component over here, we're going to have a component where we're going to be able to fetch data from this API using React Query? Well, the most simplest way to do this is to use the useQuery hook from TanStack Query. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to import from at TanStack React Query, and I want to import the useQuery hook. So in the simplest form, if you're working with React Query, there's two hooks that you need to get used to, the useQuery and the useMutation. We're going to get to the useMutation, however, we're not going to actually use it in this component. But the useQuery hook, like the name suggests, it is used for queries. So for example, for fetching data from an API. And that's exactly what we want to do here. So in order for us to use this hook, we need to come over here and call the useQuery hook. Now the hook requires us to pass in two pieces of information. The first one is a list of query keys, which are going to help us distinguish each of our queries by some sort of ID. And this ID will help us whenever we're dealing with things such as cache or just helping identifying this query. If somewhere else in our project, for example, we might want to refetch this data or retry this query, we can utilize certain functions that are provided by React Query and just pass in the query key for this query, and that will actually execute. So it is important that you make them distinct. So in our case over here, I'm going to be passing a query key called posts, which is going to represent the query for us fetching data related to posts. Now, the second thing we need to pass is a function which I'm going to create, which is going to fetch the data and return back. Now, if you have never worked with React Query in the past, you might be a bit confused because a lot of people have a misconception that React Query is a fetching library like an alternative for Axios or the Fetch API. However, this is not the case at all. It handles all of the complex stuff that happens after you get the data. So things like the loading state, the error state, caching, synchronizing your data, all that kind of stuff is what React Query is good for. So to get there, you actually need to fetch the data. So somewhere inside of here, I'm going to create this function, which is going to fetch the posts, and it's going to return back the data that we're going to pass to React Query. So inside of here, let's just do a simple const response equals to await, and we're going to fetch the data from this API over here, and we're just going to pass it over here. Then when we get this back, if response dot okay, so if not okay, so if there's any errors, then we just want to probably throw a new error saying error fetching data. But if the response was okay, then we want to return the response.json. Let me just fix this. Return the response.json. Perfect. Now that we passed this, we have successfully created our query, and we can now access all of the amazing stuff that React Query gives to us from this hook. For example, to get the data that we want to display in this component, we can just destructure the property called data. Now what this will do is I could now come over here and, for example, loop through the data, grab each post, and as an example here, let's just create a little thing that shows the title of the post. So post.title. We should see that now over here, if I actually go to the root page, and you should see that there's actually an error. And I purposely left this error because a lot of people watching this video might be watching this video because they're getting this error over here, saying that pet argument type starting with v5, only object form is allowed when calling a query related functions. What this is just that React Query updated. So the way we actually use the useQuery, we have to return an object here and specify that this is the query key and this is the query function. And also we should probably pass in over here a question mark just so that we deal with the data being null before we actually set up the errors and the loading state. We'll do this in a second. But as you can see, we successfully fetched our data and it's displaying here in the screen. Now, if we don't use this question mark over here, there's a couple of things that we could actually do to allow this to still work and not fail. Because it's failing because for a brief second, the data is not fetched. So this data thing over here is null. So what we could do is we can handle the loading state and the state in which an error occurs. So let's go to the loading phase. I'll come over here and the structure is loading, and let's also destructure error. So for the loading phase, I'm just gonna ask if is loading is equal to true. Then we can return a little p tag that is gonna say loading and 3 dots. You'll see that now that doesn't actually error because for a brief second, it will show the loading state, but it's pretty fast, so it doesn't actually, you can't really see it. But that's how it works. Now let's go for if error, then return the p tag with the message saying error occurred. Then some message showing the actual error. Now, we won't see that because no error is occurring. However, if I want to, I could just test this out. Whenever an error is thrown, you'll see that this happens. So I'm going to refresh this. It's going to load. We're going to see over here. Oh, we never returned that. So return new error. However, we could test the case in which this error is thrown by removing this and making it such that if the response is okay, then it will throw it. And you see that it will load data for a bit, and then eventually it's going to fail and it's going to throw this error. Yeah, as you can see, it says error occurred, and then the error message over here is the one thrown. Now, this is an overview of the simplest use case for React Query, which is just fetching data in a component. Now, if you are the kind of person who usually fetches your data by creating a use effect and then managing the data through local states, you should know that this is way better. And the reason for it is because, first of all, the use effect was never created with the intention of being what you use to fetch data. Second of all, you can do a lot more by using this hook whilst also not having to deal with all of the logic and the states for the loading state, the error state, and the data state. It is all generated for you automatically. It makes your component a lot dumber, which is a good thing because it will help you have an easier time testing and debugging your application. Now, one also good thing that happens with the useQuery hook is that TanStack Query automatically caches the responses of whenever you fetch data. So by default, if you're revisiting the component, it will show you the cache data instead, while optionally refetching in the background. So technically, if we were to not have this component being displayed, right? We were in a situation where we had two different components, and you unmount one of the component, and then you mount the other component. When you actually come back to this component, you have the option to just use the cached data so that you don't have to make unnecessary network requests. So let's see an example of what this means. Okay, so to demonstrate this, I changed a bit our code over here. I moved all of the code that we had before into this posts component. So it's the same thing, but in the posts component. But what I did is in our app component, I created this state that all it does is it mounts and it unmounts the component. So as I click on this button, it will show the component. And when I click it off, it will stop showing the component. If I click again, it will show again. Now, why did I do this? Because I'm going to explain caching in React Query for you guys and how useful it is. As you can see over here, every time I mount the component, it fetches posts. And then I unmount it. And when I mount it again, it fetches again. So it does two network requests, and it can do it infinitely. And the problem with that is that sometimes you don't need to do that many network requests because the data won't technically change that fast, right? So what you can do is a lot of different things. One of the specific things that you can do is set up what is known as the stale time of this query. So like I said, React Query will cache all of the response, and you can specifically tweak when the data will actually become stale and trigger a refetch by using the stale time property in the query. So if I put here, for example, 5 seconds. 5 seconds, it will have to be represented in milliseconds, so 5,000. Now, what I'm saying here to the useQuery hook is that I want the data to stay completely fresh for 5 seconds before it refetches to see new data. So if I come over here and I toggle it once, it will show. But if I toggle it anytime in between 5 seconds, it won't refetch again. When 5 seconds passes, it will actually fetch for new data, because now the stale time is over and it knows that it should be enough for us to fetch data again. So depending on what your query necessitates, so if your query probably changes data faster, you can actually make this into 2 seconds, but most times it won't be like that. Most times you can do something like 10 seconds where it will literally only fetch once, and for the next 10 seconds, it won't fetch again. So this is the most basic explanation I can give for caching. I know a lot of people get confused with it, but specifically with React Query and the useQuery hook, it's really useful because of this. Now that we understand what caching is, what other types of queries can we make in our application? So for example, there's different types of queries that we might want. An example that I can think of is whenever we want to pass parameters like fetching some sort of data by ID. This is a very common use case. So let's actually create a new component. I'm just going to actually duplicate this. Let's say post by ID. And inside of here, I'll also change this to post by ID. And inside of here, we don't want to display all of the posts. We only want to show one post depending on what prop we pass here as the ID. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to change this useQuery hook over here to have only one single different thing. Now, the difference is that over here at the top, or wherever we call this function, we probably want to have the ID passed here and then have the ID also passed inside of here. So for this API, we can just do it like this. We pass the ID here, and this will fetch one single post. Now in our query, our fetch posts over here, we have to pass the ID inside of it because now we have that as an argument. And the one major difference is that in our query key, we want to integrate the ID for this specific query as part of the query key for this useQuery. So I can change this by adding the ID here. And now we know that if we were fetching this data in a loop and fetching multiple items by their ID, the ID that we pass in the query key will make it such that the query key is completely unique. So let's just test this out. Actually, let's show this over here. I'll actually display. Actually, I'll just display one. To be honest, I'll say post by ID, and I'll why haven't I imported this? I'll just do like this: post by ID, and then post by ID as well. Oh, I just noticed it's all called posts by ID, not post. Now, there's also one thing we want to put, which is the ID over here. Let's make it such that it will fetch the post with ID 3. Also, there's two things that I want to change here. I don't want to display the data. I want to display, I'm not going to map through the data because the data is going to be a single post. So actually, I just want to display the data.title. It's just going to be one single post. Now, it's still giving us an error. And the error is because this fetch posts over here, when you're passing the ID as an argument to it, this is not actually being represented as a function. What this is doing is assigning whatever this returns to the query function, which is not what we want. We want to set a function to the query function. So whenever you're passing this, it's similar to passing an argument in a function inside of some sort of prop. You want to actually set up an anonymous function or a callback function over here that is going to call this other function. And as you can see, this works now. It will fetch the specific ID that we set, and it will get the information. Perfect. Now, let's work on the mutation part of React Query. So I created here a create post component. It's a separate one, and we're going to deal with all of that logic inside of here. So let's get started by just building up a very simple form here, which we're going to use to create this post. So I'm going to say form, just generate a form, put an input inside of it. This input will be of type text. So we'll say type is equal to text. And then we'll also put a placeholder. Probably let's just put like post title inside of here. And then we also need to have a button that is going to be used for creating the post. Now with the JSON placeholder API, they do allow you to test post requests. We're not going to actually add the data into their API, but we will actually see that it was successful. And we only need to pass in the post title for it to work. So that's pretty good for us. We're just going to use it as a testing tool. And inside of here, inside of our input over here, we want to set an onChange which what it's going to do is it's going to set a state that we're going to create over here that is going to hold the value of this input. So it's going to be a string. Let's come over here and say title and then set title. And on this onChange, we're just going to say set title is equal to the event that we're going to grab from that. And we're going to say event.target.value. Perfect. Now that we're done with that, let's create a function that is going to handle the submitting of the form. So we're going to say handle submit. It's going to have an event here as well. And we're going to first event.prevent default. Then we want to deal with the logic of mutating the data. Now we're going to call this whenever we click on the create button, and this should all be good. Now obviously nothing happens when we write a title. It doesn't actually fetch data or anything. So let's deal with that. How do we send a post request or a mutation using React Query? So to do that, we're going to also call from the React Query library, but we're going to call the useMutation hook, and you'll see it will auto import. And this hook is a bit different, but not that different. What we need to pass here is, again, a function that will actually make the post request. So let's create here a function called create post. And again, it will be async. And what this does is it will require, first of all, the new post that we're going to add. So new post over here. And inside of here, we're going to say const response is equal to await fetch. We're going to fetch the post route in this API. But it's like posts, and then we'll just make a post by actually adding over here the method and saying that it is a post method. Now let's also pass in headers so that we can specify that the content type is application/JSON. Let me take that out of the way. And then we'll also set in the body. Now the body is just going to be a stringified version of the body, the new post that we're going to pass inside of this function. Perfect. Now we're just going to return the response.json from this function, and we're going to pass this inside of this useMutation. Now, similar to the useQuery hook, we want to pass an object here, and we're going to pass in the mutation function, and the mutation function will allow us to pass in the create post. And this is going to return to us very similar things to what we got from the useQuery. The only different thing is it's going to return to us a mutate function that we can now use inside of our handle submit to call whenever we want to actually execute the mutation. Now we do have to pass here some data, and the data I want to pass in is an object that is going to represent the new post. Now I want to have a title, and the title is going to be whatever we got from that input. Now I want to set a default body that we want to add to this request. Let's just say something like this is a new post, and we don't have to pass an ID because it will auto generate for us. Now let's test to see if this will work. Now the only way for us to test again is we need to have our network request open over here and see if there was a successful post request sent when we click create. But let's put a title. Let's say new post, click create. And as you can see, we got a status 201, meaning that we successfully sent the request, and this is what we got back. The actual post that we just created with ID 101, meaning that it's an extra post on the list of 100 that we had before. Perfect. So you can see this is how you generate a mutation and how you create post requests. This would be the same for delete, for updating, for put requests, whatever you want. You would use a mutation for that. Now, one cool thing that in the case where you were displaying the, if I were to, for example, grab this logic over here, actually, I'll just grab the posts, and I were to display the posts down here. And then imagine that in the case where we create a post and it would actually add to this list, because remember, this is not how this API works. They wouldn't just allow me to send actual post requests to the API and add to the data. But imagine that this was the case, that when I create a post over here with the title new post and I click create, it would add data down here at the bottom. Then if that's the case, then this query that is being displayed on the posts component is invalid, right? Because it probably is outdated because this data will now be added to the list, and we probably want to refetch that data because that data now is outdated. So how do we do that? Well, in our create post over here, we can do something really cool, which is we can add some callback functions to if the success came from the mutation, if the error happened, if the mutation is mutating, or a bunch of others. So we want to deal with in case there was success and the post was actually added. What do we want to do? Well, if there was success in creating the post, then let's do the following. Let's call the React Query library to invalidate the query that we do in the posts component, this one over here, meaning that when you invalidate this query, it will automatically know that it's not valid and it will refetch the data. So how do we do that? Well, we need to access the query client that we created over here to actually have access to the query that we have in the post component. So to get the query client in any component other than the one you created it, you can just use a very nifty hook called useQuery client, and it will give you access to it. Then over here, I'll say query client is equal to useQuery client. Then I can, on the onSuccess over here, I can just say query client dot invalidate queries. And then I can pass a list of queries in which the data now is invalid because of the success of this mutation. Meaning that whatever query IDs or query keys I pass inside of this list, it will refetch that data. So in this case, we only want to refetch the posts data. So I'll put it over here. And you'll see that if I open up the network request, let's bring this over here. It'll be kind of hard to see, but let me refetch this. You see we have one fetch for the initial data. Then if I create here the new post, what should happen is we should see a mutation being executed, but we should also see a GET request being executed to fetch the data again. And this is exactly what happens. Obviously, again, it won't show the new user being added, but this is pretty good because this can be used in so many different ways in your application. And it makes it way easier for you to do something like this. This is one of the best parts of React Query, is that React Query allows you to control the state of your server data. So we know we use states and we use state management to deal with local data or local states. However, we never think about how to deal with the different state of our application in the server. And when you do something like this, what you're doing is you're creating a smooth and synchronized experience between the server of your app and the UI. So it's extremely useful. I believe it is one of the best ways to make your app production ready is to use a library like React Query. Now, there's two more things I want to talk about. And one of them will involve changing this component a bit. I want to talk about what is known as optimistic updates. So optimistic updates is whenever you are making a post request in your app and you want to enhance the user experience by giving it a faster feedback by optimistically assuming that the server request you just made is going to actually succeed. So that means that we're going to, if we want to, we could update the UI whenever we create a post as if the mutation has worked. Now we'll do this when the mutation succeeds immediately, but not when the server request succeeds. And well, what happens is if the server actually fails, the React Query will automatically roll back the change, giving us some sort of fast feedback in the case where it actually works, which is most of the cases, hopefully. If most of your requests are failing, there's some problem in the backend. But in the case where most of it is working, this is good because it will give your users a faster experience, even though the data actually wasn't successful yet. So how could we do something like this? So in this call for the use mutation hook, we want to deal with a couple other situations. So let's start with the onMutate. In this onMutate, we want to set an async function with the new post, which is what we're going to get back from whenever we make this mutate call, right? Because we pass it over here. Now, what do we want to do with this new post? Well, we want to await the query client, and we want to cancel any query that has the ID posts. Because if that's the case, we don't want to actually continue with that. We're going to actually manually change the query data. Then we want to grab whatever list of previous posts we had. So we can actually access the data from this query over here, from inside of this onMutate, and change it before the mutation actually finishes. So we're going to set this equal to query client, and we're just going to use the function get query data. Now this is going to give us, if we specify posts, the list that currently exists for that specific query. Now with that information, what we can do is set the query client.setQueryData to be equal to, first of all, we have to specify which query we want to change here, and we're going to change the posts query again. Then we can pass a callback function where we have access to the current state of it, which is the old the part like array that we can get from here. And all we're going to do is just set this equal to the same array as we had before, but now we're going to have a new list with an ID. And obviously, since we're doing this optimistically, we're not going to get the ID that the backend is going to generate. So we'll probably just do something like use the current date as an example here. And then we want to add here the new post that we're getting from this function. And this will allow us to manually change the data from that query. Now, in the end, we just want to return an object with the previous, previous posts. And now that should help us, because as you can see, if I open this up over here and I were to create a new post, let's call it new post, and I click create, what we should see is that now, we have to for a second just comment out the onSuccess case, and let's refresh this. Let's create the new post again, and we should see that now when we create this, we should see the new post as part of the data. Now, this is good because it assumes that our request will work. Let's create a new one as well. Let's just put random strings here, and you'll see that it does keep adding to it. So we're manually changing the data from the query. Now, why did we want to keep this? Because not necessarily, actually, it might be better for us to change this to either an onSettled, or actually it might be better to just keep it on onSuccess in this case, but we should also handle the onError in this case, because we are optimistically changing the data, and for a brief second the data hasn't finished fetching yet, but we're successfully saying that, changing the UI to show it as if that's the result that is going to appear. Now, when the onSuccess appears, which is in a brief second because fetching data is pretty fast here, we invalidate that query and it refetches the data to see the actual result, the real result. Now, if we don't set an if on error, this could be a problem because it would never invalidate that query. So it would wrongly show the manual data that we changed over here. So if there's any errors, what we might want to do is grab some stuff from here, and we can actually grab a couple pieces of information that can bring us back to the state we were before we manually changed this. For example, we can grab the error, so any error that occurred during that mutation, but also we can grab back the new post that was passed in the mutate function, and also this variable called context, which will help us because now we can just say query client dot set query data, and we can pass in, first of all, the specific query that we want to change again, but also we can pass in the context dot previous posts. And what this will do is we kept track of the previous posts, so we can now set it back to that without dealing with the change that we made over here. That's why we created this previous posts. I'm not sure if you got confused by that. I apologize if you did. But because we could now access the context and actually use it over here. Perfect. Now, if we wanted to do something else with the error and the new post, we could do it. But in this case, we don't. Now, this is great because in a lot of situations you might want to do this, and it's pretty reusable because most of the mutations that you want to do this will have the same three callback situations over here that you can just rinse and repeat and deal with it in the same way. Perfect. And that's basically it. You've now seen how TanStack React Query simplifies data fetching, caching, and updating in React apps. We covered basic queries, mutation, optimistic updates, caching, and much more. So if you like this video and want to support the channel, just leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next, because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week and I would massively appreciate it. React Query is a great library and I love making videos for it because personally, I feel like whether you're building a large-scale enterprise app or a personal side project, React Query is the way to go. It's the best solution in the market, and I am very confident in saying that. If you found this tutorial helpful and you want to check out the code will be in the description, together with a cheat sheet for this tutorial and my website, and a link to the same article if you want to check on the website dev.to. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your support, and I see you guys next time.